All right, I'm David Pinsoff,
I'm David Pietrzewski. This is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, which is a
podcast about actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists. Enjoy.
David. Today we have somebody who needs no introduction, Leda Cosmides.
Yes, Leda Cosmides, together with John Tooby, invented the field of evolutionary psychology, which is the name of this podcast, in fact, in case you didn't know that.
Yeah.
Uh, so it was a real treat to talk to Leda. We kind of wanted to save her for a while. I mean, we're almost a year now, I think, since we started
Well,
this.
almost a year. Yeah. I was going to count the
Yeah.
number of guests, but yeah, I think we're getting up on a year. Yeah.
Yeah, but we wanted to like get a lot of practice before we invited Leda on to figure out how to do this podcasting thing.
That's right. We wanted to go from JV to varsity, or at least from like
Yeah.
kindergarten to elementary school. Although we're probably just not even at we're just at the crawling to cruising stage here.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean, like, it was just fantastic conversation, just a total delight talking to Leda and just learning like a really interesting history and sociology of science and like how this thing got off the ground. And there are a lot of fun human stories that emerged. And yeah, it was a very reflective episode about how evolutionary psychology got going, where it's headed, whether there are any regrets. We talked a bit about economics and rationality and stuff, but mainly it was just kind of a sweeping retrospective of how we got here.
Yeah, it's an important part of the scientific record, and I think when you're talking about at the level of Leda or John, we're just sort of part of the messengers of getting this in the scientific record, and I'm happy that we got this a little bit, and I'm sure we'll have Leda back on. But yeah, without further ado, here is sort of episode one of Leda on evolutionary psychology, the podcast.
Enjoy.
Leda, it is well overdue for us to have you on about a podcast about evolutionary psychology. Um, I actually, on purpose, wanted to not have you on right away, though, because we also wanted to have people who are sort of younger doing the work in their earlier career stages on. Many of them we asked how they got into it and into EvPsych or into evolutionary approaches to behavior. And almost invariably, somebody read a book or a paper that inspired them. Uh, Probably, I don't know, David, you tell me, but like I think 30 to 75% of those was a paper by or book by you and John. Um,
Paper or even a conversation or
yeah,
a class. They sat in on a class or whatever. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Except for Ed Hagen, who apparently did not like John's class and disagreed with John while he was sitting in the class, which to me was hilarious. Like I would have loved to talk to Ed Hagen back then. Uh, but uh, but this is all lead into your story about how you got into evolutionary psychology cannot be I read myself and therefore I was inspired to do it. Um, so this begs the question of how does a younger or very young Leda Cosmides uh, start moving towards taking an evolutionary approach to psychology? And that's obviously a big question. And we don't have to
Not
do the
really.
whole, it's not okay. Good. Then if we please.
If I remember correctly, Dave, you were one of the people that you found the adapted mind in your college library,
Right.
which makes the pain of putting it together worth it.
Right. Exactly. It was human universals, and then human universals led me to the index of human universals, and then it was to a bunch of your papers, and then the adapted mind. Yeah.
Um, well, okay, well, this will sound odd, but um, I I was a child during the late 60s, and everybody seemed to be angry at one another. And I lived in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and there were protests. That was the daily news, which huge protest was happening. And it was during the Vietnam era. And then there was the youth culture and the generation gap, and everybody just seemed angry all the time. And I kept thinking, there has to be a better way for people to live. And then I kept thinking about that through junior high and high school, and especially high school. And thinking about that, I thought, yeah, but how would you know what that was unless you knew something about human nature? So I thought, okay, well then I need to understand human nature. And it was sort of in a vague sense. I mean, I read in 10th and 11th grade, read and then reread B.F. Skinner's Walden 2, which is it was a very famous book that almost nobody knows anymore. It's his utopian novel in which a behaviorist, basically him, is running society and running a community. Walden is it's as a Walden pun, but this is Walden 2. And he's running it based on behaviorist principles and of positive and negative reinforcement. And it was very clear that he thought that the mind was a blank slate, that everything people do is because of positive and negative reinforcement, which is sometimes called the equipotentiality assumption, that any stimulus has an equal potential for reinforcing any response. And I thought that was just wrong. I thought it was really wrong. It made no sense to me because life is too various. So sitting in a boring suburb of Washington, D.C., I thought, well, if what he's saying was true, you'd see people like swinging from the chandeliers. I mean, everybody was basically behaving the same way, and I just thought you'd see a hugely more variation between people if everything that you did was because of a history of reinforcement. And also, like, how consistent can that history of reinforcement be? It made no sense to me. Plus, it was, he was basically arguing things like, that you could, through the right history of reinforcement, you could make, a mother just as happy to be nursing somebody else's child as her own child, or that you could make somebody deliriously happy to walk in on their spouse having sex with somebody else. And just with the right history of reinforcement, they'd be thrilled by that. And that just didn't make sense to me either. So when my dad was a psychopharmacologist, an early psychopharmacologist, and used to pound the table about the importance of interdisciplinary research, which as a child, I always thought, obviously, why is he pounding the table? Sometimes it would be about the Freudians because they were very much against psychopharmacology, but he was at NIH and he was always pounding the table. And I was like, why do you have to pound the table? I don't understand this table pounding about this because this is obvious. And when I grew up, I realized it was not obvious to most people. And I guess also in that environment, the idea of taking a more of some sort of biological approach to understanding human nature made sense to me. But at the time, by the time I was a senior in college and ready to start college, the only thing like that I knew about was psychobiology. But in my freshman year, I realized I don't like psychobiology. I mean, I'm glad people do it. I'm glad people study neurons and hormones, but it wasn't telling me anything even remotely like what I wanted to know. It was not what I wanted to know. And by the end of my freshman year, I was having kind of a crisis because I didn't know what to major in. I hated the process. Like, I would have gone nuts doing that research. I'm glad there's people that do that research, to be clear, but it shouldn't be me. And I thought, how can I do, I still want to understand human nature, but how can I do that if I don't feel like I'm getting any answers, and if the process is not something, is something that I hate, you know? And so that summer, I did a lot of things that summer. Among the things that I read, just because they were on my parents' shelf, I read Konrad Lorenz's On Aggression and Robert Ardrey's Territorial Imperative, and this was basically ethology. And if you think about it, ethology kind of is cognitive psychology. Um, with the full trappings of an information processing revolution that happened in the next few years, but it is trying to understand the design of the mind of non-human organisms in their natural environment. And I thought that was very interesting. I wasn't aware of the things about group selection versus not group selection and in Konrad Lorenz's On Aggression and so on. But I thought those were interesting, but I still had no idea what I had to declare a major. And so when I got back to school like a week early or something, and so I thought freshman week, they had a year before, they had told us to get these two books to read before we got there, because freshman week there was going to be these two different lectures for us. And one of them was E.O. Wilson, and the book was The Ant Society. And I thought that lecture was really interesting. I thought it was really interesting. So not knowing what to do, I thought, I'll talk to Professor Wilson about this. He seemed like an interesting guy. I'll see what he says about this. And so I went to, I made an appointment with him, and he was important for the rest of my life, 5 minutes late. And that was important because on the corkboard next to his door, there was the flyleaf of his new book that had just come out. This is fall of 1976. His new book, Sociobiology, which I'd never heard of before. And on the flyleaf, on the back flyleaf, it said, this field it's not about how organisms do things. It's about why they do things. Why do they behave this way rather than that way? Why? And it said it applied to humans too. And I thought, why? That's what I want to know. Why? Why do we behave the way that we do? So with the hubris of a 19-year-old, when he showed up, I said, okay, Professor Wilson, this sociobiology thing that you wrote about, that's what I want to major in. That's what I want to do. I want to understand human nature. I want to do it from this perspective. What should I do? What should I major in? And he said very sensibly, he said, well, you could either major in psychology or in biology. He said, if you later decide to go to graduate school in evolutionary biology, that would be hard to do if you majored in psychology as an undergraduate. On the other hand, if you got a good foundation in evolutionary biology, then you would probably still be able to go to graduate school in psychology if you wanted. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And then he said, and then, well, this had good and bad consequences. But he says, and you should get this younger professor, Robert Trivers, to be your advisor. And so I said, okay. And so that's how, well, but see, the thing, I still wanted to understand human nature. And that's more than the questions about ultimate causation. That's more than why. It's how, but it's how on a cognitive level. And cognitive thinking was on the newer side at that time. And but it was clear that was necessary, that was a necessary level of explanation, and what information are you processing? What's the design of the mind? And that wasn't what was happening so there was Irvin Dvoor, who's an anthropologist, who was part of several different revolutions, was at Harvard, and he had something called the Simeon Seminar. And the Simeon Seminar met like 4 or 5 times a semester, and it was in Irv Dvoor's living room. And some of those famous people in the field came through and talked at that, and including John Maynard Smith, the great evolutionary biologist. Um, Richard Dawkins did, W.D. Hamilton. Irv had a lot of graduate students who were primatologists and doing field work in primatology, and so it was like his lab group in a way, but with the people coming through just astonishing. Joseph Sheffer, who did the red light of incest, who did the kibbutz studies on incest, all these people were coming through Irv's living room. And that was phenomenal, and a really good background in evolutionary biology, and some thinking by people who were approaching behavior from an evolutionary point of view, but very broadly. So a lot of what they were doing was noting correspondences that were kind of loose between selection pressures and social organization. So yes, kin selection implies that kinship will be a very important part uh, of human life and who we help and so on. And yes, anthropologically, you see that many societies are organized along kin lines, although in complicated ways. But it was too loose of a correspondence. There was a missing level. There was selection pressures, and then there was manifest social organization. But the thing that's connecting them is missing, because there has to be a mind that people have to have minds that are making decisions and wanting to do some things and not other things. I mean, that's the human nature part. And so in the simian seminars, that was largely missing. And people would also engage in fitness teleology, including, by the way, Trivers. They'd
So
say things
what
like,
is, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
so fitness teleology is it's sort of assuming, well, it's assuming that people are doing things to spread their genes,
Hmm.
as if they have
Yeah,
a motive to spread their genes, as if
yeah,
it's a depth psychology,
yeah.
and that whatever you may be thinking on the surface, deep down you want to spread your genes.
Hmm.
And uh, without people really exactly understanding that there were psychological implications to what they were saying. And so they'd say things like, well, these monks, medieval monks who are being celibate, how are they must be doing that to increase their inclusive fitness. How is that increasing their inclusive fitness? Oh, well, maybe they're helping their siblings, maybe it's a helpers at the nest kind of phenomenon. No, you have a psychology, it's leading you in different environments to do certain things. And it's not because deep down you're trying to spread your genes. I don't think it makes any sense to say that a celibate monk is choosing to be a celibate monk instead of having a family to spread his genes. That's not what natural selection is about. Natural selection is it's an account. It's a causal account of how you come to have the phenotype that you have. And in this case, it's a cognitive phenotype. In this case, it's how do you come to have the psychological mechanisms that you have, okay? And so when a mother loves her child and is taking care of her child, it's not because deep down she wants to spread her genes. That has nothing to do with it. It's that mammal mothers who had psychological mechanisms that caused them to care for their children, to provision their children, to make sure they're safe, had more children. They had more offspring than those that neglected their offspring. And that's why selection favored maternal psychologies that cause you to take care of your children. It's not a depth psychology. And so that's what I mean by fitness teleology. People
Hmm.
are acting as if you have a deep down motive to spread your genes. And that's a forward-looking thing. It's perspective. It's assuming that here I am, there are various things I could do right now, and I will choose them based on which one is going to spread my genes the most. And also, natural selection is not about spreading your genes in general. It's about why genes underlying one design feature outcompete those underlying another design feature. So this whole level of design was missing in how people were talking about it, except of course from George Williams. and Adaptation and Natural Selection, which many of us had read. But when people read, it's like a Rorschach test. When people read, anybody watching this, if you haven't read George Williams' 1966 Adaptation and Natural Selection, do it now.
Yeah.
It's still it's still a classic.
Yes.
But people's reactions to George Williams, it's almost like a Rorschach test. Because it's two components of it. One is the gene is the unit of selection. And he's very clear, and he talks about the subtitle is a critique of some current evolutionary thought. And so he brings up a Scottish biologist named Wynne Edwards, who proposed that the reason why in populations of deer, there'll be the weaker, the 90-pound weaklings will in hard winters will not try to reproduce. And he said that's in order for the stronger ones to reproduce, and that's for the good of the group. And George Williams goes through the logic of that and, why that's not going to work, because what if there's a mutation in one of these deer that makes them want to try to have sex if it's safe to do so. That's going to be favored over this restraint and so on. So one part of George Williams is the gene as a unit of selection. And this is actually the first book of evolutionary biology I read, which is because selfish gene wasn't out yet. And it's great, but it was hard going for that to be your first evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
But the second half of George Williams was about adaptationism. And in fact, it starts out saying adaptation is an onerous concept for which you have to have evidence of special design. And you have to show that that the trait you're talking about is not more parsimoniously explained as a byproduct of another adaptation or as a byproduct of just physical law. He says, so to understand why a flying fish comes out of the ocean, yes, you have to invoke adaptations to understand why it comes out of the ocean, but why it comes back in, that's gravity, right? You don't need to, nothing special for it coming back in. Although I suppose there could be different ways you could land back in, but anyway. So it's funny because some people, when they read George Williams, they get the adaptationism out of it. And other people read it and they get the gene as a unit of selection out of it. And it's as if they haven't seen the adaptation part. So George Williams had both, and his emphasis was on design. That I think he even says, I don't remember if he says this or he quotes somebody else saying, he says, the question is not reproduction per se, the question is designed for reproduction.
Yeah.
And so I only took 2 psychology courses as a biology major. I took my first freshman year a social psychology course. It was okay. But then I took a behaviorist course called Motivation in Action that was taught by Richard Herrnstein, who was a complicated person, but a very brilliant but complicated person. And it's from him that I actually learned about the equipotentiality assumption. I learned that there was a name. I learned that there was a name for the thing that I objected to in Skinner's book. The thing to realize is that Herrnstein was Skinner's star pupil and basically took over the Skinner labs at Harvard. And they only had 2 major disputes in their life. One was that Skinner wanted to believe, because he was very utopian in his thinking, and he wanted to believe that punishment doesn't work, that causing pain does not work in terms of operant conditioning, but it clearly does. And Skinner thought of Mao's China as sort of a large-scale experiment in Walden 2. And at the time, that it was a very closed society. And you could know that very bad things were happening in Maoist China, but if you wanted to not know, you could not know. And so one of their big arguments was about that, because Skinner didn't want to acknowledge that that was a thing. But the other one was about the equipotentiality assumption, because Herrnstein knew that that was false. And he knew it because there had been a number of different demonstrations that it's false. One of the biggest ones was the experiments by John Garcia, which if you had to, sometimes people will say, well, what is the most important experiment of the 20th century in psychology? I would say the Garcia's experiments.
Yeah.
This is where about learned taste aversions, and he's showing that he had rats that are simultaneously they taste an unusual flavor, and at the same time a red light goes on and I think it's a red light and a sound goes on. Then what happens is one set of the rats, their feet are shocked 2 seconds later. The other set of rats, they're dosed with x-rays, or sometimes it was a chemical that makes them nauseated, that nauseates them. Rats don't actually vomit, but they become nauseated. And then the question was, if the rats then presented with the option to go to unflavored water with the light and the sound, or flavored water with no light and sound, are they equally likely to go to either one? And the answer is not at all. The ones who were nauseated avoided the flavored water, the unusually flavored water. And they were fine going to where the light and sound was. They were lapping up the water. His graph is actually laps per minute. They were happy to drink the unflavored water with the light and sound. And the ones who had their feet shocked, they were fine drinking the flavored water. They did not avoid the flavored water. And basically, it was showing that it's completely false that it's equally easy to pair any stimulus with any response. You can pair the stimulus of a taste very easily with nausea, but you cannot pair it with the electric shock to the feet. They just don't buy it. And you can very easily pair the electric shock to the feet with the light and sound, but they don't avoid at all the flavored water, and yet they were exposed to all three at the same time, and then they were subjected to this negative outcome. There couldn't be a more clear refutation of the equipotentiality assumption, and using the same methods that behaviorists typically use. And it was so disturbing to the behaviorist community that he couldn't get it published for a really long time. Journals say, well, he must have done something wrong because this violates the
Well, at least they were following their logic, right? If they understood the inhalants. So Herrnstein this was a disagreement with Skinner. Did Herrnstein communicate what Skinner thought about this study?
Yeah. So So Herrnstein wrote this great paper. It's still a great paper, and it's an American Psychologist in 1978. And the title it ended up with is The Evolution of Behaviorism. Okay, but that was not its initial title. It's a paper that's saying why the equipotentiality assumption is false. Okay, and it goes through Garcia, and it goes through the Breland and Breland experiments. They're animal trainers that were they just couldn't get the raccoons in their commercial to do certain things. You know, I won't go through it, but they were finding that it was the commercial they were trying to create. It was eliciting a species typical behavior where raccoons rub something and dip it. And anyway, something they were not being reinforced to do. I can't remember which other things were in it. It also had the observation that when it comes to similarity, psychological similarity, we don't construe similarity along simple physical dimensions like Skinner thought. If you think about similarity of colors in terms of wavelength, red is the longest wavelength and blue is the shortest wavelength. Green is intermediate. If it was simple physical dimensions, we should see green is more similar to red than blue is. But that's not at all true. Through purple, it's like the color circle, the color spectrum is bent, electromagnetic spectrum is bent like this. And red is seen as much more similar to blue than to green, which is at the other end of the color circle. And so one of the things that Herrnstein was pointing out is that from a psychological point of view, the similarity space that we have, it's not simple physical dimensions. The same is true when it comes to, a piano. Middle C sounds more like the C that comes an octave above than it does to D. Anyway, the thing was, the initial title of the paper was Post-Skinnerian Behaviorism. And He said Skinner found it on his desk, saw that on his desk, and hit the roof. I was very, very upset. And which is why he changed it to, the evolution of behaviorism.
That a draft? I mean,
it was a draft.
Okay, because I mean, it was Skinner, so who knows? Maybe it could have gotten published and redacted to the different title.
No.
Yeah, but okay, yeah.
It just upset Skinner so much that
Right.
he.
Right.
But it's evolution of behaviorism, a better title anyway.
It's pretty good, yeah.
It's more indicative of the content of the paper than post-Skinnerian behaviorism.
Yeah. It's not about the person, yeah.
No. But that was like a full-throated why equipotentiality is wrong. Now, it's not that Herrnstein then liked domain-specific, the idea of domain-specific mechanism. He called that botanizing drives. He really didn't like that. He continued to not like that. It was so funny. He had the same conversation, had the same conversation with John 5 years earlier that he had with me about this kind of thing. But anyway, so I was I was in additionally, even though I wasn't a psychology major, I was in an environment of a psychologist because I was doing my I was such an idiot. I was doing my research senior thesis research, but I started it earlier on with pigeons, on mental rotation in pigeons. And the reason that I had been talking with Hertzstein was one of the people that was interesting to go to his office hours. There were certain professors that were very interesting to go to office hours and talk to. And so I was a big office hour goer. And in fact, that's actually partly because of Hertzstein, because he had said in the class that I took my sophomore year, he'd said, I have to have 2 hours of office hours every week and nobody ever comes. And I'm just sitting there bored. And so I thought, I'll come. That's how I became an office hour goer. But in talking to him, one thing he brought up, Roger Shepard had done the mental rotation studies that came out, the Shepard and Metzler studies in 1971. And actually that was one of the things that made a big impression on Hertzstein and why he put himself, there were research and training groups in the psychology department, and rather than areas, so that a person could be on several research and training groups. And, Hertzstein had always been on the behaviorist one, but it was the Roger Shepard's mental rotation experiments that caused him to put himself on the cognitive one as well. Because it was very clear that the most parsimonious explanation for those results was that there's mental representations, and that people are imagining with these blocks that you can't tell by their features. They're imagining that they're a rotation to see whether they're both left-handed or one's left-handed, one's right-handed, and so on. That's where I learned about Roger Shepard's research, which is funny because I ended up doing a postdoc with Roger Shepard later. But the reason I ended up doing this thing with pigeons is because Hertzstein in the hall at some point was passing by. He's very mysteriously said that this would be an interesting topic, mental rotations in pigeons, because he said very mysteriously, because it would show whether pigeons have a mind. And I thought, oh, it doesn't in any way. I mean, actually, like my senior year, I went to talk to Steve Coughlin, who had done a lot of research on mental imagery. And I said I said, Professor Coughlin, I'm doing this thing on mental rotation. If they can do this mental rotation thing, does that mean that they have a mind? And he said, sort of in disgust, he says, it has nothing to do with it, nothing. And then he took a paper he had on imagery and mine, and he threw it at me and he said, read this. And
it sounds like a cartoon, but it's real, right? Like it's a parody of academia, right?
Yeah. So I read it and he was right. It had nothing to do with it. Yeah. So, I mean, just because somebody's grumpy doesn't mean that they're not worth talking to. There's lots of people who are kind of grumpy but still very worth talking to. That's just how they are. Some professors are grumpy because they figure you're only going to come back and talk to them if you really, really want to know stuff.
I mean, I get grumpy when people are wrong and they won't admit that they're wrong, and so I get it.
So the heuristic is the grumpier the person, the more likely they
Yeah,
are to be right. That's
I don't know.
I
No,
don't
some
know.
people I've known people who
yeah,
in fact I think Steve Coughlin later told me because he became for a brief period my advisor in graduate school that was kind of a strategy of his that people, if people
yeah,
really wanted to know something and were really interested he'd weed
yeah,
out the ones that didn't care by being grumpy at first.
yes,
Anyway, and so anyway, at the Simeon seminar, people were thinking in this way, and it just seemed to be missing a major thing, which is a psychological level of explanation. I'm saying all this much more clearly than I would have at the time.
sure,
Um, and I could also, it was clear to me from what little I knew about cognitive psychology, um, which included, Dave, this will be relevant to you, ties to you, which included this is the time when the who said what paradigm when that great paper that
yeah,
Shelley Taylor, Susan
hmm
Fiske, Eckhart and Rudderman paper
yeah,
that came out in 1978,
yeah,
and it had this really cool method where
mm,
you could see how people were categorizing things, which and somehow I heard about that and I thought that's really neat. You can you can do experiments that are going to reveal something about
yeah,
how the mind works. And I thought, okay, these cognitive psychologists, because they were early social cognition people. These cognitive psychologists, they've got methods. They know how to ask questions about how the mind works. So I should go to graduate school in cognitive
mm,
psychology. But anyway, in the course of these seminars, there would be these discussions, and they were sort of off from the point of view. They're really interesting, but off from this point of view. And then there was this undergraduates never are shy to raise their hands because this is a graduate seminar. And I would go to this and I would be this polite undergraduate raising my hand. But of course, when there's a bunch of graduate students there, you can't get a word in edgewise because they don't raise hands, they just
yeah.
jump in, right?
They're the worst graduate students.
Yeah. No, it's like, but
It's wonderful. We were all
what you need
graduate
is
students. Yes.
what you need is undergraduates to jump in too.
No, exactly. Yes, yes.
But there would be some debate going on, and I think, no, this is just completely wrong. They're missing a really important point. Sometimes it was about the philosophy of science, lots of different things. And I'd be there, and then there would be this one graduate student that would suddenly say exactly what I was thinking,
Hmm.
exactly. And I was like, who is this person? Like, this is really weird. Why is this one person saying exactly? I was a little bit hurt, like, because this is a pattern that kept happening. And that was John Tooby. Um, that's how I met. That's how I met John. That's how I became aware of John's existence.
Yes.
I mean, I think he had been at these things, and I just like, I didn't know everybody that was at these things, but I became aware of John's existence when he was this person saying things that were exactly what I wanted to, what I was about to say, and that were not even close to what other people were saying. And that's how I ended up talking to John about things.
Yeah.
John, he came to this from a different path. He was actually originally planning to be a physicist, and he had as a teenager read a lot of Poul Anderson books, a science fiction writer who often imagined other worlds, other planets, and where evolution had gone differently, and the intelligent beings from these other planets thought and felt very differently than humans. Um, but he was going to be a physicist, and then his freshman year, he took a class by Eric Wanner, who was a psycholinguist. And Eric Wanner was showing how these experiments, and they can use reaction time, and you can find out where phrase boundaries are in a person's head. And John was like, "Oh my God, you could actually have a science of the mind." And so he thought, physicists can go that they're okay without me. But this where you could actually find out how the mind works, this is really this is really important and interesting. And he thought evolutionarily because of all the in part because of, I don't know if it was entirely, but in part because of the Poul Anderson books, also because of the Schrodinger What is Life, about life being the only anti-entropic, process. Um, and so John signed up to be a psychology major. But then all the cognitive psychologists in the Harvard Department of Psychology and Social Relations, which is what it was called at the time, they all were kind of squeezed out by the behaviorists and psychophysicists. So John was left in the midst of behaviorism, and John's 5 years older than me, so this was happening before I was there. So he was writing a senior thesis, but it was basically the senior thesis. I've never seen it, but it would be interesting if I could ever find it in the millions of papers. It was a brief for why behaviorism was just wrong and why you had to take an evolutionary approach to psychology. And Skinner had a famous book called The Behavior of Organisms. And John's thesis, I don't remember what he told me that he called it, but it started out saying, because most of the behaviorist work was with rats and pigeons, right? And it started out saying organisms applies to more than rats and pigeons. It includes orchids and, and a list of other kinds of animals, etc. And he wrote 300 pages apparently. And whoever was giving it a look before he turned it in, I'm not sure if he finished it at 300 pages, told him to not bother to turn it in because it just wouldn't fly. This is why at Harvard you have to do a senior thesis in a topic for your diploma to say that your degree is in, in this case in psychology, and otherwise your bachelor's degree is in general studies. So John's technically is in general studies because after writing 300 pages of this dissertation, he took the guy's advice and didn't turn it in. So it's not technically in psychology. He was a psychology major. It's really hard for people to realize now, but everything was in the behaviorism had like a death grip on the field of psychology, and it had for many, many years. It's not some antique view from my point of view. It's the view that was dominating almost all the thinking at the time. Enough so that, they made it, Jerome Bruner left, he had been doing cognitive development, and they just made it uncomfortable for anybody who was doing cognitive stuff. So anyway, that's, and then I started talking to John sometime in the middle of my senior year. We started talking and discovered that we were thinking about things in the same way in many domains of life, but including about psychology.
Yeah. Where the thinking at that sort of computational middle level, is that something you just felt like was the way you always thought, or was that?
I don't know how to answer the question.
Yeah, it's fair. Yeah.
If you know that the equipotentiality assumption is wrong, then you know that there's such a thing as a mind, whether you use the term mind or not, because you know that there's some cognitive mechanism that is making it that is making it more likely that you think that the nausea was caused by what you ate than something else. And I do believe I thought about it. Yeah, no, I did think about it. I did think about it as a cognitive level of explanation, because I was kind of obsessed with certain topics. I was a bit obsessed with Klein, and Klein had arguments that I took to be why equipotentiality is wrong, although I don't think that Klein meant them that way.
No, he was because he was like a pretty rabid behaviorist.
I think
I mean,
I
that
think
was I mean, it is weird because, yeah, if you read, I also, per your recommendations, I've looked at that. And so what he explicitly will say, but then what, like, yeah, the GABA problem, being a great
the Galileo
example.
problem
Yeah.
is really, really important, and I
Yeah.
teach that to all of my students always.
Yeah.
The indeterminacy problem that without some structure to the mind, you're never going to learn anything.
Yeah. If a rabbit runs
Where
across the road and you're in some other country or civilization and they yell
planet, no,
GABA,
another
yeah.
planet,
Yeah. Other
another
planet.
planet
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
you don't even where you cannot assume that they have the same cognition as
That's
you
right.
do.
Yeah.
Which is why, he shows that there's an infinite number of things that GABA guy could refer to.
Right.
And if you've managed to know what the alien, well, yes and no in the alien language, and he points and says GABA guy, then you have to ask, well, is this GABA guy pointing to fur? No. Is this GABA guy? But then there's an infinite number of these things. It
Yeah.
could be rabbit or light bulb. It could be, and Klein goes through all of this, which I took it as an argument that there has to be, that there has to be a structure to the mind to solve this problem
Yeah.
because it's a combinatorial explosion problem.
Yeah, and I think Hume actually did land there. Like as much as he was an empiricist,
Did he?
yeah, because I remember I would read Hume being the empiricist, and he wasn't to some degree, and he obviously had a big influence on Skinner. But reading Hume again, I think he was a fellow traveler. Like he definitely there's human nature in there. So yeah,
There, it's really funny. John thinks that I have a very peculiar sense of humor because as a joke in my, I think it was my dissertation, I have a little quote from Hume at the beginning of one of the chapters, and it's a quote where he's saying it's not from any. I'll just put it in my terms. It's not from any sensorially detectable quality of bread that you know that it can nurture your body. It's not detectable.
right.
He's basically saying there's something else that's like leading you to assume that
Yeah.
that you can live by eating bread.
Yeah.
And the reason it was a little joke for me because I thought of Hume as a huge blank
Yeah.
slate empiricist.
Yeah.
Yet here he was saying that there's something the mind is predisposed to know.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Exactly.
understand.
Yeah.
It's a joke to me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
because I think it was the beginning of a chapter of my dissertation on why there have to be domain specific mechanisms.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I think Hume got revised by the behaviorists. I actually think that there's a place to set the record straight for Hume, I would argue. Yeah.
well, apparently he was. Well, I'm not even going to say I'm going to get it wrong, but there was people that he was arguing with where the argument had to do with the church and
It's the Don Simon. You have to know who somebody's arguing with, right? Exactly.
Yes,
Even
yes.
Descartes. Yeah, same thing. Yeah.
My daughter has told me this, and I keep forgetting who it was he was arguing with. I apologize. So yeah, I think I was unfair to Hume.
No, it's okay. We
He's dead. He'll forget.
But I mean,
Yeah.
but also Klein made it really clear that you had to at least have it had to be a property of the mind, sensory dimensions, what dimensions of the world that you're even capable of perceiving had to be
Yeah.
something that was part of human nature. And so
yeah.
I actually was guided to Klein by Bernstein.
Yeah.
So meet Klein. I got to meet Klein before I left graduate school.
That's great.
It was very cool. I was telling him about he used to teach the logic course. The only time he didn't teach the logic course was the one year that I took it, unfortunately, because I really wanted to take something from him. But I did get to meet him before I left, and I told him about the experiments on social exchange and cheater detection and how people were using logical reasoning to do it. And he thought that was very cool. I thought it was very cool that Klein thought it was cool.
Yeah.
But
it's very cool. Another version of this question, because I mean, independent of how you think you got to this point, is there's also this sort of like elephant in the room of that both the evolutionary and the cognitive people or the psychologists are being sort of blind to this level of description. And that sounds like, I mean, really, what I'm hearing you say is, and I read this in the writings
Oh,
or
the evolutionary people were definitely blind to this level of
yeah,
description.
yeah. And so,
Not all of them. So not Martin Daly and Margaret
right.
Wilson, for example. They were
Yeah,
always,
we just had Martin on actually. So,
oh, great,
yeah.
great. They
So
were
this,
always, they were trained as comparative psychologists. So they were studying the psychology of non-human animals.
yeah.
They were never blind to it. There was people, and then other people would be sometimes blind to it and sometimes not blind to it. They were like funny. People are often funny amalgams of things.
Yeah.
Um,
So when you're talking to John about this, and then you're seeing this landscape of missing this, a lot of the papers were about making this argument. Was the idea that it was when you guys were having this, did you land on that people just aren't applying they're not thinking the right way, and it just wasn't
they're missing an
natural for
entire level of
people?
explanation.
Yeah.
See, you have to understand something. In the sociobiology community at Harvard and elsewhere, what was valorized was ultimate level explanations, theories about selection pressures. Of course, Trivers valorized whatever Trivers did, and that was theories about selection pressures. That was social theory. And then theories about like psychology, for example, that was mere proximate mechanisms. It wasn't like that's important. Proximate
Right.
mechanisms are actually that which Darwinism was designed to explain. That
Right, the
that's
phenotype.
the
Just
phenotype of
it's the little
organisms.
it's just the phenotype. Yep.
That's the explanandum. That's
Right,
what
exactly.
natural selection's
Yeah.
trying to explain, how you get complex functional design in organisms without there being a creator. But at the time, it was being treated as something trivial because what what the people with vision wanted to understand was the selection pressures.
Mhm.
And I love selection pressures.
Yeah.
That's but because that was being valorized at the expense of the proximate mechanisms. And in fairness, people like a lot of research on proximate mechanisms wasn't necessarily that interesting at the time because it was
Right.
before the cognitive revolution was just sort of starting. It wasn't in full bloom. So a whole cognitive level explanation was not known to most people.
Yeah.
I mean, it was obvious to John because when he was in high school, he programmed in Fortran, and he knew how to program and so forth. But yeah, I guess yes, I did, because I wrote to myself a lot of times things about why the mind cannot be a blank slate and things like this. One thing that I didn't fully realize is I thought that there could be some domain. This is just as an undergraduate, this is not after. I thought that there were surely had to be lots of domain specific psychological mechanisms, or else but I thought that it was not impossible that there could be such a thing as a domain-specific mechanism that tracked fitness. And I hadn't fully realized that that's computationally impossible.
Mm.
And part of my realizing that that's because I was thinking that this is something to be empirically adjudicated.
Right. Right.
And it was in talking, John invited me my last semester of college. He invited me to sit in on a seminar he was teaching rather, which was very, very interesting. But so it was, I don't know. It was then or later that I realized that the computational possibility of a completely domain general system causing behavior that would have tracked fitness ancestrally.
Yeah.
So I was all on board about the importance of domain-specific mechanisms. But yeah,
Yeah.
the
So my attribution as a student of yours and John's was that it was a timing issue, and that you guys were there, could see that the computational level was there enough that if we connect up psychology with evolution, that's fireworks happen in a way that is kind of rare scientifically. Like it was sort of a unique time and a unique place where these things could come together.
Yes. It's not that people hadn't previously thought that evolution could illuminate psychology. Darwin thought that, right? I mean, and
Yep.
um, Darwin thought that. There had been various attempts to take on psychology with an evolutionary lens. I mean, William James thought that. Um, um, John Bowlby certainly thought that. I mean, John Bowlby was, I consider him an early evolutionary psychologist with attachment theory. He started with like primate behavior, and he thought that clearly there were mechanisms that kept an infant monkey staying within range of his mother and going back to her when frightened and using her as a base of exploration. He thought that was an evolved mechanism. Um, but there wasn't a language. And even when you look at the early ethologists, who I do think of as cognitive psychologists, they were still doing things before cognitive psychology was really much of a thing. And so they're grasping towards explanations. And that's why they talk about things like fixed action patterns and so forth, because I think it's because they lack more of fuller throated language of information processing.
Yeah.
And so yes, this cognitive revolution was happening around the same time. It's full of revolutions.
Yeah.
And but people, this is why like there's an 87 paper that we wrote. It's actually based on the fourth chapter of my dissertation, because I have a very too long dissertation. Because part of what I had to do is explain why you would take an evolutionary perspective to cognition in the first place.
Yeah.
And what would that lead you to think differently? And so there's a whole chapter about why you would expect domain-specific mechanisms, since the empirical work was about a domain-specific reasoning mechanism for detecting cheaters, right?
Right.
And so we worked that chapter into this 1987 paper, and the title of it is From Evolution to Behavior, Evolutionary Psychology as the Missing Link. And the audience we had in mind, actually, when we wrote that paper, was sort of the sociobiology community,
Right.
because this was a missing link in their thinking. So yeah, that paper wasn't even aimed particularly at psychologists. It was aimed at the people who were just going straight from selection pressures to behavior without a pit stop on how the mind works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, David, feel free to jump in. Fast forwarding. So there's people are missing this cognitive or computational level. What is your opinion now? So we were doing history and we can kind of go back and forth. What is your take on to the extent to which people do understand that level, or the extent to which it's still not adequately understood, either in psychology or even in evolutionary psychology?
Not adequately understood. A little understood, but less applied than it could be. And a lot of people, even in evolutionary psychology, are not fully adaptationist in the sense of looking for evidence of special design. But it's all so much better than what came before that you can't even believe it.
Right.
I mean, there was just nothing in psychology, nothing. You wouldn't even come across the word natural selection or evolution in a psychology article ever, let alone have hypotheses that were derived from evolutionary principles.
Your cognition,
So
you told me, I alluded to this earlier on an earlier episode of your just trying to get your Wason stuff
yeah, it was insane.
published, just because of the source of the hypothesis
It was
that
because
had,
of the
yeah.
source of the hypothesis. It was literally, I could have been playing pinball and had the idea And that would have been okay.
Yeah.
But the fact that it was sort of logically derived from, Trivers' evolution of reciprocal altruism, selection pressures, was what was making it not okay.
Yeah.
No, it was
Yeah, Leda,
horrible.
some future historian of science will use that for having a logger narrative of the theory crisis in psychology and early 20th and 21st century psychology theory, I'm sure.
It could be. I think it's not the easiest thing in the world to think computationally. I mean,
No,
I could
yeah.
use work on it myself.
Yeah, and this is another question is like I think yeah, because I mean even among the all levels of evolutionary psychologists or even just getting students, I do sometimes wonder that if the psychology part of evolutionary psychology is the harder one than the evolutionary part. Yeah,
Oh, I think it
Yeah.
absolutely is.
yeah,
Yeah.
I do think it
Totally.
is. Yes. Yes,
Yeah. I
absolutely.
mean, in part because we have such a rich folk psychology system that we lean on for explaining people. And it's very hard to jettison that, to let that go, to put it aside,
Right.
and take to activate a different module in the mind, to think about the
Yes.
mind, to use your sort of folk mechanics mechanism to think about minds. It's really tricky for people to do. Um,
Or
and I saw
I think it's your artifact
yeah,
module. I
artifact.
think
yeah,
it's,
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it. It's a different way of looking at minds than we are intuitively accustomed to. And it comes more naturally to some people than others, for sure. But yeah, I sometimes have a hard time doing that. It's like it's hard to let go of the fact that I'm a little homunculus that's seeking, mental
Yes.
substances of good vibes and bad vibes.
Yes. Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
yeah.
Well,
Um,
that's why when I teach undergraduates, I teach it completely from the artifact module point of view, the design
yeah.
stance that we're looking for machines that are designed to perform functions.
Yeah. And I
And
know,
and
yeah.
and
Yeah.
I teach that a good way to think about genes from this perspective is to think about them as particles of design.
Yeah.
That they're the means by which a design replicates itself through generations. It's sort of like in the extended phenotype, which is actually my favorite Dawkins book, is the extended phenotype.
yeah,
And he's got these necrocubes on the front of it. And the point that he's making is you can do a Gestalt switch on the necrocube about the perspective you're taking, that talking about individual reproduction versus inclusive fitness is a necrocube shift. And so if you think about Hamilton and kin selection theory, that's actually that's seeing it from the perspective of the reproduction of an individual, right? That the individual is trading off some of the individual's own reproduction to help increase the reproduction of say, a sibling. Um, but if you're thinking about it from the gene side point of view, genes that code for designs that promote their own reproduction are going to be selected for regardless of who they're in, right? I mean, and so part of the point of the extended phenotype is he was gently saying, you can do this Gestalt switch to a gene's eye view, in which case things look kind of different. So yeah, no, I teach entirely from when we were in graduate school, John used to say, when we understand enough about the mind, we'll understand more about how to explain this.
yeah, exactly. Yes.
And so it was really useful learning about, research on the idea that we have mechanisms that are for understanding tools, and the tools have functions, they're designed for functions and so forth. I found that helpful. But yeah, no, I think it's really um, not easy to do. And I think there's probably things that we miss. I shouldn't say we, people like me who did not have training in, computer programming. I think there's things that we miss about how psychological mechanisms need to be designed, or what are good ways to design them. And I that's sort of, distressing sometimes. I feel like I have to go back to school. There's lots of things I have to go back to school to learn.
But I think that's to your credit, though. I think that when you're confident that you know everything that's when you should hang your spurs up, right? I think that's the that engineering approach to things, and that there are people like Don Simons or Martin and Margot. When you encountered people like that, and maybe this comes back to the original question, I'm always just mystified, like where people like that come from, who are just design minded, and they're sort of fellow travelers. Um, can you continue the story then? If so, you and John, how did you discover Don Simons, and how did
Well,
that?
first we
Yeah.
discovered Daly and Wilson,
Mm,
and that was simple because Martin Daly and Margot Wilson spent a sabbatical year at Harvard when we were
yeah.
graduate students,
Okay.
and they were at the Simeon Seminar the whole time. Well, even before that, there was a psychology wide seminar that people actually came to. Um, but the speakers were actually chosen by graduate students. And so um, I was on that committee, I think, my freshman year. And Martin was one of the people that I suggested. And so Martin spoke. But then they came, I can't remember which year it was. I think that might have been 80, 83, 84, 82, 83, around that time. They said they spent the whole year there. It was great. We talked many times.
Mm,
Um, and then um, Don came to all of this in a different way, Don Simons. Um, he was doing, I think he was a psychology major as an undergraduate. But then he went to graduate school in biological anthropology. Well, I'm not sure what the formal division was, but he was a student of Sherry Washburn's at
mm,
Berkeley. And Don, his dissertation was on aggression and play in rhesus monkeys. And it was an adaptationist analysis where he was saying, look, if you look carefully at how rhesus monkeys play, it has features of special design for calibrating your ability to fight. There's turn taking. One will be like on top, and then they'll switch and the other one would be on top. There's a play face that signals this isn't true aggression. This is we're just practicing. He went through various features of design from his watching in the field watching the rhesus monkeys. And so he was Don, I don't know, Don was always an adaptationist. And I don't know how that came to be.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, Don would have, of course, read a lot of ethology
Right.
for sure.
Yeah.
And he wasn't in the middle of the sociobiology thing because um, um, I think he's 15 years older than me.
Okay.
Yeah. And but when it came to The Evolution of Human Sexuality, his book that came out in 1979, he just thought and thought and thought and thought about this for a very, very long time, and from an evolutionary point of view. And I don't know how he came to study that. Don always said that he liked to study things that he liked,
Mm.
and sex was one of those things he
Yeah.
liked.
Totally straightforward. Yeah.
That he liked to sleep. He wrote a very cool paper about dreaming called "The
Mm,
Stuff Dreams Are Not Made Of."
that's great.
That was published in Cognition. He loved eating interesting things, and he would have blind taste
Oh,
tests of
nice.
different things.
That's great.
And so he thought about doing food, but then he decided that there was too much literature on that
Right.
already, and he didn't want to go through all that.
Yeah. Very
Uh,
reasonable.
he thought about doing laughter and humor, but then when he started reading about humor, he found everything he found about humor was so humorless. He couldn't stand it.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Although he did get his float article, right? It's if nobody's
Yes,
read the float
float
article,
is
it's a
funny.
it's a parody. Yeah.
Yes.
Didn't he always say there wasn't enough? I think even in that, I think he said there's not enough humor in psychology.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But so well, since Don can't speak for himself since he died in 2024, um, the people watching this might or might not know about the famous bet that was made between Don Simons and Don Brown. Don Brown, who later wrote Human Universals.
Yeah,
But
which
the
was the
bet
book that got
was
me. Yeah, that was the book that got me. Yeah.
first book that got you. So Don Simons told Brown that he said, I'm going to write a book about the evolution of human sexuality. And he said, I think there's going to be some universals of human sexuality. And I'm going to go through all the ethnographic record. I'm going to look at this from an evolutionary point of view, et cetera. And Don Brown, who was trained as a political anthropologist, Don Brown says, any universal you think you find, I'm going to be able to find an exception. And Simon says, I don't think so. And Brown says, I'm sure I will be able to. So they made a bet about that. And they bet a pitcher of beer. And after Simons wrote what he wrote and did his research, Brown couldn't find any exceptions to the things that Simons said. And so acknowledged that Simons clearly had won the bet. And then Brown started asking himself, why was I so sure? Why was I so sure? Because there had been a tradition in anthropology of looking both at universals and at things that varied from culture to culture. But the field had sort of changed more into being interested only in variation. And so he started asking, why was I so sure that there would be no universals? And he, in the course that I started reading more of the history of anthropology, and that's why he wrote Human Universals, which he dedicated to Simons. So that's where the book that got you into this field came from. It was his thinking about the bet.
Yeah.
And the fact that he made the bet in the first place.
Yeah.
And actually they hadn't done the official pitcher of beer thing yet. And so in our first or second year here at UCSB, there was an anthro picnic party at in the hills where Don Brown and Don Simons lived. And there was a ceremonial giving of the pitcher of beer from Brown to Simons. So I got to see that.
That's fantastic.
It was
historical.
It was,
moment.
but yeah, that's where it came from.
Yeah.
It's such a lovely story. I feel like it's an example of science working how it should be. Like making a bet about something that you think is true and then changing your mind when the data come in and you're wrong and admitting that. And it's an inspiring story. I wish that we had more of that kind of thing happening. I think we should bet more pitchers of beer on various
Pitchers of beer. Yeah,
things.
no, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
You have to be actually care about what's true.
Yeah.
And I'm not always clear that people do. I had an informal bet like that I completely lost. This has to do with work that recent work that I did and am continuing with Ricardo Guzman in Chile. I had been too influenced by Tversky and Kahneman. I mean, even though I thought that they were wrong about lots of things, and I and John and Gerd Gigerenzer had done research showing that when you put the same probability problems, when you express them in frequencies and absolute frequencies, natural frequencies, that people do very well. So I knew that Tversky and Kahneman they're not wrong about the phenomena. If you don't do that, people will be bad at conditional probabilities. But it doesn't mean that the mind doesn't have mechanisms that are well designed for statistical reasoning. You just have to give it information in the right format. But still, they had made other claims as well, like that that people violate the principles of rational choice all the time, and that people wouldn't possibly be able to, that they're not capable of being transitive, like having transitive preferences, which people always explain as if you like A better than B and B better than C, then you'll like A better than C. Although that's a terrible way of putting it, because A, B, and C are not things like John's taller than Nike and Nike's taller than Leda, so John's taller. They're bundles of goods,
Yes.
like, 5 avocados and 3 tomatoes and 20 tomatoes and 5 avocados. There's bundles, A, B, and C are bundles of goods. So it's very not communicated well to people who are not in economics. But anyway.
Right, and the alternatives also give you information about the nature of the sample that is being drawn from, and you're going to make different inferences if the alternatives are different, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
You know that guy at UC San Diego that did research on that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm blanking on his name right. He's at the business school at UCSD, and I came across this guy's paper in a journal that had economics in the title, and I'm reading it, and he starts out talking about, well, that's a little bit off topic. Anyway, I'll find it and send it to you. But he not only makes that argument, he demonstrates it. So
Cool.
anyway, but I had believed them about that people would, not be able to have transitive reasoning. I thought that their prospect theory and other things I thought that had been shown. And Ricardo Guzman, my colleague, said, no, I think that people will be rational in the sense of rational choice. And I think we should do this with moral trade-offs, because people keep saying things like that, either you're being utilitarian and using your domain general reasoning, deliberative reasoning system, or you have these crude emotions that will make you not push the guy off of the footbridge in the trolley problem, and that they're fighting, and that's how and so Ricardo said that's not going to be true. People are going to be able to make trade-offs between different kinds of moral values, but you need to have a different kind of moral dilemma in order to even test that, because nobody even gives you the opportunity to, because you only have either push the guy off the bridge in front of the trolley to save the 5 people, or don't push the guy and let the 5 people die. It's only 2 options there. And anyway, he said, I'm sure it's going to work out that people will not only be able to make trade-offs, but they'll make rational trade-offs. And I said, but there's all this stuff in psychology. He says, no, that's what's going to happen. And he was completely right. He was gloriously right, to my surprise. So, people behaved exactly as if they're doing what economists talk about when they talk about generating a utility function, and then using whatever options are available to you, the costs and benefits of the options available to you, to choose which is the best option. The economists are not psychological about it, though. The economists, they say that they are agnostic about the mind. So when they give theories like this about utility maximization, it's not about what's going on in an individual's mind, which is very interesting. It took me years to figure out what the hell they were talking about. I would go to these behavioral economics workshops here that would happen once every 2 years, that Gary Charnes would put on, who also died recently. Everybody's dying all around me. It's really frustrating and upsetting. But I would go to these when I could, and there would be these 40-minute talks. The first 20 minutes would be a beautiful experiment, like some sort of behavioral economics experiment. It might be in a lab, it might be in the field, with gorgeous results, and anybody I know in psychology would have been thrilled to have done these experiments themselves. Very interpretable results. And then the second 20 minutes, they'd be writing some full utility function on a board. And like I'd be zoning out during that. And I'm like, and so I asked people afterwards, I said, what is this utility function? What is it? I said, is this a theory of the computation? Is this like a David Marr kind of, I explained that. Is this a theory of what problem the mind is trying to solve? And the economist would, and this was the economist, it's not somebody Dave, but this economist who is friendly to psychology, and so he said, no, it has nothing to do with the human mind. And I said, but you do think that individuals are making the decisions in these experiments. He said, yes, of course. And I said, and you do think it has something to do with their brains? And he said, yes, of course. And he said, but the utility function has nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
I was like, what is it? And actually, it turns out he's right, and that is the traditional view, and it has nothing to do with what's going on in the mind in the way economists think about it. The way economists think about it, their problem is different. Their problem is usually understanding a market. And markets have millions of anonymous people trading in them. And the utility functions an input-output device where that takes quantities like price and income, and it outputs what's likely demand or what's the likely supply.
Yeah.
And so they're asking questions like if the price of corn goes up, if there's a drought and the price of corn goes up, what'll happen to demand for corn chips? That's the kind of question they're asking, and that isn't about a mind. It's like it's a piece of technology for predicting what'll happen in a market. Now, it happens that some behavioral economists have made it almost a theory of the mind without really saying that, but the economists are usually very careful to say that people are behaving as if they're maximizing a utility function, and then when they're being very, and then even more precisely, there are theorems that show that in this measure of GARP that we use, it doesn't matter. It's a measure of whether people are making transitive choices. That if people's responses respect GARP, then there exists at least one utility function that, if rationalized, could explain the data.
Right.
That's the way they say
qualified, yes.
because then they can prove that. They can prove. And so we were saying, it's not, we were saying, look, the most parsimonious explanation for our results is that people are behaving as if they're maximizing this function because that is what their mind is doing. It's maximize. It's built a function. We called it a rightness function because it was about moral rightness. It's built this function, and then it's choosing from the set the one that has the maximum rightness, and it has machinery for doing that. And so it's not just that they're behaving as if they are, because that really is the simplest explanation for our moral trade-off data.
Yeah.
So
If they
anyway,
were
it's really,
just, it would be quite a coincidence that they just happen to behave as if their minds are
yes.
performing these computations. Like, why don't you just say that they're actually doing the computations? Like, that's a much
No,
simpler.
I know, but see,
Yeah.
but everybody's interested in different questions, and the economists
Yeah.
are not interested in individual minds, right?
Yeah.
Except there's this group of like the judgment decision making.
Yes. Yeah, I sat in on that community for 9.5 years. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're very like, heuristics and biases oriented, a lot of them. But it's so funny because like even the term behavioral economics versus experimental economics, they have different flavors to them. Because the person who really invented experimental economics, where you have people bring people in an experiment and you put them in a, it can be a prisoner's dilemma or a trust game or all these different games. That was Vernon Smith and his colleagues. He did it with Charlie Plott and various other people. He had a very a great group around him. Kevin McCabe, Elizabeth Hoffman. I think Bart Wilson was part of that group. And Vernon Smith, when he learned about evolutionary psychology, he and Elizabeth Hoffman, et cetera, they realized that a lot of they were finding in their lab that people did not behave as if their preferences were homo economicus preferences. Rational choice doesn't mean that you're always choosing the thing that has the highest monetary payoff. It means that whatever your preferences are, you're choosing the one that's best of your, given how you weight various things. The idea that you're always going to choose the highest paying option is a theory about preferences, and people call that homo economicus, economic man. And Vernon Smith was, had shown very early, he and his group very early, that if you have 27 people in a lab and they're interacting with one another in these games, they do not behave as if they're maximizing short-term profits. They behave as if they're in a small hunter-gatherer group where there's going to be repeated interactions, whether, even if you, no matter what you tell them. And so they wrote, there's a Hoffman, McCabe, and Smith paper from 1998 that's great, where they were reinterpreting all of their results in light of, evolutionary psychology and theory of mind and things like this, and saying, look, there's something different that's going on in small groups than what you see in mass markets. And so the experimental economics people kind of went, at least some of them, in more psych direction, whereas the people influenced more by Tversky and Kahneman went into this heuristics and biases direction. And that really, when people say behavioral economics, now they use it to refer to all of it, right? But initially it was sort of a difference in the use of the term, where the behavioral economics community was more the heuristics and biases, decision-making, cognition, decision-making people, and the experimental economics had more to do with these. It's too bad that the larger community didn't take the turn that Vernon Smith and his colleagues took. Because that's the more interesting turn where you're asking, well, how does the mind work, and how looking at these games as having to do with interactions of people, and as being produced by programs that evolved for a different kind of social world where people did know each other and there were repeated interactions. So I always find the history of these different disciplines really interesting. Because it's part of the Simon's principle that you can't understand somebody unless you know who they're arguing with. And unless you know what kind of question they're trying to answer. I mean, once I realized how the economists thought about utility functions, I realized that's completely sane. If you want to know what's happening in a large market to supply and demand, this is completely sane. So they have utility functions that represent, a household, what they think of as a consumption bundle for a typical household. And then they use it. It's very useful for them making predictions and so forth. But you got to know what they're trying to do, because they're not always trying to do what you're trying to do. Sometimes they have a completely different question in mind.
This reminds me a little bit of the David Hume point, which is, in some sense, Leda, I think one way to describe what you and John did so well and do so well is you're a contemporary historian of science. Which is, you're not looking in deep history, you're looking at what is the scientific landscape, and the ability to sort of articulate, well, here is this group of people and here's what the assumptions they're making, here's what their goal is. That is surprisingly rare, to do it at any time, and especially concurrently, because there are status games and it takes courage to sort of speak up when the real flesh and blood stuff is happening. And I think that, I hadn't really thought of this till this conversation, but I think that very much describes one of the things that you guys do and did so well, is just articulate.
Well, you have to be willing to listen to people.
Yeah.
And you have to be, like, you may think that people are on the wrong path about something, and that's fine, but you're going to be better off if you assume that they're intelligent human beings. And if they're making assumptions that are different than the ones that you're making, they probably have reasons why they're doing that. And it would be good to know what those reasons are. So in Psychological Foundations of Culture, in the beginning of it, about the standard social science model, that is that deconstruction of that is John's trying to say, what are the good reasons why people adopted this notion of the standard social science model? And if you don't know so it's always better to assume that people aren't idiots, to assume that they're smart people and they're coming from different assumptions, and you got to know what those assumptions are. And you have to know what kind of problem they're trying to solve, what kind of question they're trying to answer. And you have to not get frustrated. This is really hard. You can't get super frustrated when they're not using terms the way that you're using them, or when they're using them in a way that you find to be fuzzy. you have to be, because sometimes you're using ways you're using terms in ways that other people think are fuzzy and you don't realize it too. But it can take a lot of time and patience sometimes. Me being able to get into an economist's head was a long process, and it was helped by conversations with both Ricardo and Ryan Opria, my colleague here at UCSB, who just left for Berkeley, abandoned us for Berkeley to my distress. I would ask them these different questions. And Ryan actually he had been the second to last student of Vernon Smith's, and he actually shared an office with Rob Kurzban at one point at Chapman, I think. Anyway, so he had known some evolutionary psychology since he was a graduate student. So Ryan is good at translating between disciplines, and Ricardo had this background in computer science and economics. And so for Ricardo, the computational part's easy, right? That's the part that most people have trouble with evolutionary psychology, but for him that was like obvious. And so I would ask them questions separately, and I get an answer in one way I get this exact same answer from them both, but from very different perspectives. Ricardo would tell me that for the technical reasons why you do these this way and why people make these assumptions, and then Ryan would give me the historical background of why. But they would always have the exact same. It was funny because their conclusion about what it is that economists think and why they think it would be exactly the same, which gave me some confidence in what they were both, that I wasn't hearing an outlandish view. So, but it can take a long time. People use the term rationality differently.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the term rationality is used in completely different ways in different fields. In psychology, starting with, well, especially with Tversky and Kahneman, but not just them. Peter Wason was interested in logical reasoning, right? And he's the father of the study of reasoning in psychology, wonderful psychologist. And Tversky and Kahneman, they use rationality to mean judgments that conform to principles, either principles of logic or mathematical theorems about probability, or the Savage axioms, which is relevant to that. And that's sort of where they get the economic stuff, although it seems to me that there are aspects of their writing that misinterpret the economic perspective. Because, for example, when you're doing prospect theory that people think of as showing that people have preference reversals, it's different groups of subjects. You can't actually test whether somebody is violating principles of rational choice unless you test the same person in with different prices and different situations. You can't have one group of subjects hearing about, like in that disease problem, that 600 people will die if you do nothing, and there's these two plans. One plan will definitely save 200 people, and the other plan has a 1/3 chance of saving 600 and a 2/3 chance of everybody dying, which these have the same expected value of 200 lives. Which plan do you prefer? And if you put it in terms of lives saved, people, all else equal, prefer definitely 200. If you put it in terms of lives lost, they're not the same people, they're different people. They'll say they want the riskier option that has a chance of saving everybody. And that doesn't show anything about preference reversals, because you can't show anything about preference reversals unless you're doing the same situation in the same person. It might arguably be testing some auxiliary assumptions, but then Larry Fiddick and Sandeep Mishra did these beautiful experiments on that exact problem, showing that if you know what the person feels that their need level is, their preference is, like, do I feel like I need to save at least 200 people, or do I feel that I need to save at least 300 people? if you need to save at least 300 people, you have to pick the risky option because you'll
Yeah.
have zero chance of saving 300 people.
Yeah.
You will save fewer than that. You must. So
Yeah.
when you either set a need level or you ask somebody what their need level is, the framing doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter what you put in lives lost, lives saved. It makes zero difference. And people do exactly the rational thing. They will choose the option that's most likely to achieve their need level. And if you don't ask them a need level in advance, but you ask that you have them make a choice and you do the loss versus gain frame, and you ask them afterwards, what was the minimum number of people you felt you had to save? It turns out that when you put it in terms of saving lives, that number is lower, that people felt that they needed to save than when you put it in terms of people dying. They set a higher need level. And so all the phrasing in terms of lives saved and lives lost was doing was changing what people decided their need level was. So what rationality means is really different in different fields. And rational choice theory, which came out of game theory and math and economics, has nothing to do with either logic or mathematics.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with either one.
Yeah.
And
also,
so,
yeah. And it also has to do with like the social dimension of it. Like when you describe a certain problem, like a disease is going to kill X number of people or whatever, like that's a linguistic phenomenon, and you have to draw inferences about what my intentions are based on that communicative act. And you're going to draw different inferences if I frame the situation differently. You're going to have different inferences about like what the social expectations are, and you're going to have different. And those expectations could be correct. You could be judged differently if you respond to the utterance framed in one way versus another way. And there's actually research showing that if when people make the quote unquote irrational decision in those types of disease situations, people actually judge them morally as better if they make the irrational decision, quote unquote, than if they make the rational one. Because there's a social dimension to it where people are making inferences about your character and your priorities and what you're setting the need level as when you're given a certain type of information. So that is another dimension that is often ignored in these problems. Just how fluid and language is, and how we have to infer so much about the informative intention of the situation, about the person giving you the information, and the likely social expectations about responding to that utterance. So anyway, that's another.
Also, another thing, like all this stuff about deliberative reasoning and so forth, it might be that when you're in conversation with somebody, they're pointing out some aspect of the problem that you weren't thinking about.
Yeah.
So, if somebody's talking about saving lives, it might not just be that you're just going with their expectations, but you're not really thinking as much about the number of people that will die. I mean, so I think that most times when people are having moral arguments or political arguments and so forth, one of the things that is happening is you can change your mind because you're seeing that there's a part of the problem of the issue that you just had not considered before. And so like, for example, I actually think this fits, even though Jonathan Haidt doesn't talk much about this, it is actually in part of his work, because, he talks about the moral dumbfounding and how people will have a reaction like that incest is gross. And then you challenge all the reasons that they give, and the reasons you could challenge them all, and that has nothing to do with it. But I think that absolutely happens. But I think that one of the things that happens when people talk is issues are brought out that you didn't think about before. Like, if you're thinking about an issue with soldiers in war, won't it matter to you whether they were drafted against their will and miserable and want to return to their families, as opposed to whether they were volunteers who were happy to fight for their country? When that, and if you're talking about like some particular war, might it not make a difference to your judgment about it if somebody points out that these are people that are being, asked, that if they're being drafted, they're being asked to kill people and with no consent, and it can bring out, so a soldier's not just a soldier,
Yeah.
right? There's a difference in how you might think about it depending on whether they volunteered or whether they were drafted. And this is not something specific to soldiers, it's about anything you can think about. One of the things that happens when people discuss issues is you see that there's aspects of the problem you didn't think about before. And that's usually not how people talk about when they talk about the effects of reasoning. And whether you want to call it reasoning or not, I think it's what it's doing is it's changing the way you frame the problem, right? And I think David's right that part of how you frame the problem, it can also involve what these people expect from me and how they'll judge me. That can absolutely be part of the framing of the problem. But all these things, they're going to affect what, if I was being an economist, they might affect what utility function I create. Because I think that the economists are wrong when they think you have a gigantic utility function that applies to all space and time. I think these are generated on the fly in response to situations. I think that's more cognitively reasonable, and that we also showed it in our moral trade-off studies. But yeah, no, it's hard. It's really, really worthwhile to do things across disciplines, and but it's not simple, right?
Yeah. This also goes in the category. I mean, I think the lesson of sort of treating things that you might easily poo-poo or think are stupid with respect. I think it goes in this category of like there's a million ways to be wrong and only a few ways to be right, which I think it hurts yourself as a scientist if you. I mean, this advice from you and John is something that many of your students took of just, and anecdotally, like I've heard people say they would see you and John being very happy about a talk that some of the early graduate students thought was quote unquote dumb. And it was because you were learning something that the graduate students were missing. And I think this is sort of being a more mature person, which is that, and it goes back to there's lots of ways to be wrong and only a couple of ways to be right, is if you, at the moment you think something's dumb, it stops you thinking about, well, in what way is it right? Or like in what respect could it be correct and what insight
Right.
is there? And that's
Right.
where I think like even to this day, like I think one of the things, and this is kind of implicit, but Dave and I have talked about it, like in evolutionary psychology, because it selects for people who say, look, I don't like the way mainstream psychology is happening. I like evolutionary approaches. It's easy. And I mean, I did this myself where it'd be sort of like, well, this is dumb. And there was a sense in which it was like the things I didn't like were wrong. I mean, this is, what attracted me to psych. But at the same time, the more mature evolutionary psychologist that I am now, it's making this point of there was a sense in which all of that was right, but I can understand the way it was right, even though
Right.
I didn't agree with it at the time. And I think that's an important, mature way
Yes.
to approach science. Yeah.
When you're hearing a talk, even if you think all of the person's conclusions are wrong, even if you think that their approach is wrong, it's really hard to find a talk where there's nothing interesting in their data because you have your own mind and you have your own questions in mind. And sometimes their data is telling you something or suggesting something very interesting with respect to your own, what you're thinking. I mean, it's not that there's never a talk that
Yeah, exactly.
but
Yeah.
I'd say like 90% of the time there's something interesting I'm learning or thinking about from the talk that I'm hearing. I like hearing talks because I read really slowly. And so it's good for me to be able to hear somebody speaking out loud and explaining what they're thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. I like that. And also people don't always explain that when they write a paper.
Yes.
Right? People don't always explain why they're asking the question that they are asking. And in a talk, usually they do.
Yeah. Papers are weird artifacts.
Oh my God.
Yeah. To put it
Yes.
mildly.
We should be submitting, recorded monologues to journals, and it should be audio journals.
I just learned that there's this thing called it's not open to us because we don't have a research grant from the right European entity, but it's called Open Research Europe.
Hmm.
You heard about this?
Mm-mm.
It's doing things the way that John always had this notion about how publishing should work. And in many ways it's doing that. So what you do is if you've got a grant from whatever foundation or it is in Europe, they want the data to be openly available. So when you write up the paper, it's published immediately. Then the editors ask people to be peer reviewers and signed peer reviewers. And so often people are more careful and how they say things. And those reviews will be posted. And then I believe other people can submit commentaries and so forth, so that there can be like the sharing of ideas in general without it taking like, 3 years for the paper to see the light of day. I thought that was really interesting that somebody figured out a way of doing it. Unfortunately, it's not something that the three of us can submit anything to because we don't have the grant from the right agencies, or I assume not,
Right.
in Europe. But I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Insert joke about Elsevier here, but yeah, that's another issue. Leda, we're coming towards the end of our time. I'm sure we'll have you back on. Is there something that we should have asked you? I'm sure there's like 40 things, but yeah.
I don't know. I'm getting kind of old, and so if there's anything you want to know about deep time, I'm one of the oldest people left to
Well, I mean,
tell you.
a question I wanted to ask you, you put forward with John this new way of thinking about human nature and the human condition. And you've had a few decades now to observe the results, the impact it has had on the world, and on intellectual life. Um, are there any regrets you have about the way that you put those ideas forward, the way you framed them? Is there anything you would go back and change if you could do it all over again? Um,
Nope. Nope. And also I'm really okay. So I'm usually the cheerier view and John's the darker view.
Yeah.
But I'm amazed that how this kind of thinking has taken off. It's hard to find in almost any domain that I'm interested in, where people aren't now considering, well, so if you're watching, even if you're watching podcasts about health, people in terms of diets will be saying, well, what would have we've been eating ancestrally? What would that have been like? Maybe we're adapted to some of that. Or you will hear it when you're listening to like medical researchers talking, a podcast by medical researchers. They'll be actually considering something that they were never considering before. That doesn't mean that they're full-blown adaptationists, but they're I actually years ago I was sitting, Dave, you remember Tupelo Junction? It used to be
Yeah,
downtown here.
a lovely restaurant in Santa Barbara that I wish still
Yes.
exists. Yes.
Yes. Well, apparently it exists down near where Aaron Lukaszewski lives.
Okay, so more towards LA, yeah.
Yes. I was sitting there years ago and I could hear at the next table some undergraduate talking to his parents and saying, but you see, when we would have been hunter-gatherers, I would have been hunting, and I can't remember what he was. I think he was talking about like it might have had to do with maybe his parents thought he was doing too much sports and not enough. So I don't remember what the context was. I just remember laughing to myself because that is not something you would have heard, 5 years before. And now I hear this all over the place. It's a thought in people's minds that they bring up all the time. And the idea that we have a psychology that is shaped by those past circumstances is now part of how people think. And I think that that's the most important thing, like that it be something that people have in mind and that they're considering. Do I wish that people were more cognitive or more computational in their thinking? Yes, but I mean, at least in psychology. But the situation is so much better than it ever was before. It's so much better than it ever was before that I think it's great. You have to have the idea in people's heads before they can, take off with it.
Yeah.
So no, no, I stand by it. The one thing that I wish we could change was uh, when we wrote the journal personality article, the one about on the universality of human nature and the uniqueness of the individual. That, and maybe also in 89 thing, we use the term innate. And the year that we were at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences with Martin Daly and Marco Wilson and David Buss, Martin would yell at us for using the term innate,
Yeah.
and he was right. He said, look, the question is whether some aspect of the phenotype was a target of selection.
Yeah.
Innate means a million things to a million people. Do you mean that it doesn't develop? No, you don't mean it doesn't develop. Do you mean that its development is not influenced by any environmental contingencies? No, you don't mean that. And he was completely right. I mean, I usually, it's longer, but I usually say reliably developing species typical mechanisms, or I say an adaptation, by which I mean a reliably developing species typical mechanism that was designed by natural selection. Um, uh, Martin was completely right about that. And I think the term innate does take people down the wrong paths. Like they'll start to think, oh, well, something must be present in a newborn, or it's not innate, or, I have to show that it's there before they're, a year old. Or there are lots of things that make no sense. I mean, I see David has a beard here, and I'm guessing that he wasn't born with that beard. Lots of things that are reliably developing features of phenotype were not present at birth. So that, but no, sometimes people thought we were too harsh. I don't actually think we were ever too harsh. I think in psychological foundations of culture and talking about the standard social science model, I think it was a very sympathetic rendering of why people would go in that direction, a desire to not be racist, to not be sexist. It's just that they were wrong, that the alternative implies that you will be racist.
Yeah.
The alternative does not mean that you are racist or sexist. The people were not understanding the difference between causes of individual differences and universal aspects of human nature. So I don't think we were the least bit harsh. I think we were really sympathetic. We didn't say you're a bunch of bozos. We're saying here are the really good reasons why somebody would take this point of view. You take somebody from one continent, you raise them on another continent, they behave like the people on the new continent. I mean, I think it was very sympathetic. People always think that you're like trying to take their tribe to task. And, the universality of human nature and uniqueness of the individual paper, like a lot of behavior geneticists were angry because they said we're saying they're just studying noise, which is a genetic noise, which is not exactly what we were saying. I think of it as more we were saying, what are the criteria for saying that individual differences are the products of adaptations? But no, I don't, no.
Yeah. No, it's easy to fall into the trap, I think, of regretting a framing or a term uh, based on the way in which it is misunderstood by people. I remember, Richard Dawkins had regrets that he titled his book The Selfish Gene because so many people misinterpreted it as implying that we're genetically selfish, right? When, and, he wishes he would have
That,
called it
that,
the immortal gene, right?
yes.
But I actually think he's wrong. I think it's correct to call it the selfish gene. I think that is the best way to describe it and the most insightful way to describe it. Yes, some people have misunderstood it, but you cannot judge the utility of a metaphor or framing based on the misunderstandings of people. You have to judge it by its clarity and its insight among the people who do understand it. And you're making me think that like, yeah, I sometimes regret using the term propaganda or propagandistic bias in my paper on political belief systems.
Yeah, I
You know,
disagree with that, David. I think you should.
yeah,
I think it's great. I think propaganda should be called out when it is. Yeah,
yeah, and you're making me think that maybe I
yeah.
shouldn't like regret that. Like, yeah, it's kind of a harsh way of putting it, but I also think it's an insightful way of putting it, and I think that's the best way to judge something. So yeah,
You're,
um,
you're never going to please everybody. There's
yeah,
no thing you can write that will please everybody.
Yeah.
Whenever I get really frustrated and feel attacked, um, my dad said, "What are you talking about? Jesus Christ was crucified." You know, you're not going to do anything, say anything where nobody's going to object, right?
Yeah.
Sort of puts it in perspective. If somebody can be Jesus Christ and preaching peace and love and still they're nailed to a cross, yeah, you're never gonna make everybody happy. There's nothing
Yeah.
you can do that's gonna make even if you try to make everybody happy, you won't make everybody happy, right?
Yeah.
You'll either do something super bland, and then people who don't want to read something super bland will not be happy. It's
Yeah.
just not possible. It's one of these things that one shouldn't even aspire to because it's not possible. What you should aspire to is being clear,
Yeah.
right? Clear and also respectful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't think we were ever disrespectful.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think respecting the intelligence of things you disagree with, I think, has been really a North Star of that work.
Yes. This is also why um, when you ask questions in a talk of somebody, it should never be hostile. I mean, it should never be asked
Yeah.
in an angry way.
Yes.
It because or when you're writing a review, it's just no call for being angry. Just explain what you think is, if it's a review, explain what you think is wrong and what's right and what's wrong. And when you're asking it in a talk and a question, it's important to be polite. It's important for science to be polite, because in science, people have to be willing to acknowledge when they were wrong about something. And if you make this about them as a human being, that you're destroying them as a person, they will never admit when they're wrong about something, and
Yeah.
it's mean.
Yeah.
It's mean, but more than that, it's bad for science. You just want to ask the question as clearly as you can, um, and not feel that that is censoring yourself. That's not censoring yourself. It's being clear and respecting the human being. You want to be like the British are, where they'll be tearing each other apart in a seminar, and then they'll be at the pub drinking beer together afterwards and laughing together. That's a better way. I asked once, how is this happening? And they go, well, we're just all stuck on this island, so we have to get along.
Bet the pitcher of beer.
Yeah.
At the
That's,
pitcher of beer.
Yeah.
it's a
The beer
common,
pitcher litmus test. If you can't,
yeah.
if it's not that level of civility, maybe don't. Yeah.
That's right.
Or
That's right.
specificity where you have a
Yeah.
specific claim that you could
Yeah.
learn
Right.
from with an empirical
Right.
test.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
also part of the beauty of that. It's
Yeah.
not only the amicability and the friendliness of we're going to have a beer over this, but it's also like you're actually testing your idea against reality.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I agree.
It's standing side by side doing science.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's lovely. Yeah, Leda, I mean, I think, we'll definitely have you back on, but thank you for being here. And on that last note, I think we often get to sort of like, on the way out of our episodes, we get to say something about people's influence. And I think I don't even have to say your influence and John's influence on the field. But what I've come to love about what you and John embodied is that you guys truly are scientists. In this way of just respecting what's true and trying to be respectful of people. And I didn't realize how rare that was until I continued in the academy. And there really is a difference between academics and scientists, and not every academic even aspires to be a scientist. So that's fine, and not everyone should be. But there are many academics that purport to be scientists who are not in this sort of definition. And you and John are very much scientists in ways that I still work hard to be like. So, yeah.
Well, that human nature thing, that human nature thing sometimes gets in the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of strong selection pressures to not be a scientist.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Or
Well,
no,
thank
I
you
maybe,
very
think
yeah,
much for
yeah,
for having me on. I appreciate it, and I think what you're doing is great. I know a lot of people who listen to your podcast. Um,
that's
so
great.
yeah.
You'll have to tell us who they are. Probably know who they are, but thank you, Lita. It was absolutely lovely, and yeah, I'm sure we'll have you on again.
yeah,
Okay.
All right.
thanks so much. Well, here you are, still listening. You just listened to an episode with Leda Cosmides, one of the founders of evolutionary psychology. So if you like that episode and you like what we're doing here on Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, you can support us. And how can people support us, Dave?
Read the 1987 missing link paper by John and Lita,
Yep.
and read the EvPsych primer on the CP website,
Yeah.
and leave some reviews. Send David a fanny pack.
Yeah.
You still haven't gotten the fanny pack, I assume.
No, I'm really miffed about this. No one's
Okay.
sending me a fanny pack. I'm fanny
Okay.
packless.
Yeah.
Um,
We haven't gotten any emails about t-shirts. If you run a t-shirt concern, please send us that. We should
yeah.
start getting gear. Yeah.
Some gear. Yeah, maybe.
At least
Well, I mean, if you want gear, then support us because that's the only way we're going to be able to pay for the gear.
mm.
So, yeah.
What gear?
I mean, t-shirts and fanny packs for sure. Maybe a hat. Um, might be cool to have evolutionary psychology shoes.
That's not what I was expecting. What kind of shoes?
Like shoes with like, kind of like brains on them. I don't know.
Yeah, but no, well, yes, that part. But I mean, like, what if they aside from the logo, like, what's genre of shoes?
Just like, sneakers, I
Okay,
was thinking.
okay.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining like so you got a baseball cap, fanny pack T-shirt, and like kind of like 1950s gym shoes, basically like
I,
Chucks or
I was
something.
thinking more like Air Tooby,
Okay, all right, yeah,
like Air Jordans,
okay, yeah,
Air Cosmides, I don't know.
okay. It's very like 90s in a nice like kind of throwback way. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want any of that cool gear, you gotta pony up on Patreon
Okay.
because this stuff ain't free.
Is this all black? I'm imagining.
Yeah. Yeah, it's black.
It has a very Cards Against Humanity aesthetic, actually. It wasn't what I was going for, but yeah.
That's true. It does, coincidentally. I mean,
Mm.
it's the ultimate aesthetic, really.
Do you guys ever the joke around about changing that to like a color? Or is that locked in? That's part of the
Oh,
brand.
it's locked in. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of crazy that we were able to lock in, black and white
Not
Helvetica.
the easy
Like the two
yeah. The
like the two
lowest.
most different possible colors in the most widespread possible font to like we somehow own that now.
That's awesome. Good for you
Yeah.
guys. Yeah. Hey,
Yeah.
that's
So,
that's when you yeah. Anyway, on that note, yeah, please support the podcast and also just leave some positive reviews. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to read the comments, and I'm really enjoying the occasional offbeat criticism too. I have to say, keep those coming as
yeah.
well.
We love criticism just as much as praise as long as it's given in a respectful way. Honestly.
Yeah. And
It's
if it
all about
isn't,
the respect.
it's interesting and sometimes funny.
That's true. Yeah. Either way, we're going to be happy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, please dish
Okay.
it out.
Everybody, thanks for listening. David, have a good week, and I'll see you next week.
All right. See ya.